The smell of expensive incense filled every corner of the royal chamber, but it could not hide the scent of sickness underneath. Peter Walsh pushed his cleaning cart through the doorway, keeping his eyes down as 3 physicians in flowing robes swept past him without a glance. To them, he was furniture, just another human servant in a palace full of beings far greater than himself. Princess Lyra lay in her massive bed, propped up by pillows that adjusted themselves to support her weakening body. Her scales, which should have gleamed like polished amethysts, looked dull and lifeless. The magnificent wings folded against her back seemed too heavy for her to lift. She had been dying for 3 months, and nobody knew why. Peter had only worked in the palace for 6 weeks. Before that, he had been a paramedic in Chicago, running calls in the worst neighborhoods, seeing things that would make most people quit. When the recruitment officers came to Earth looking for workers willing to go off-world, he had signed up without hesitation. His marriage had fallen apart. His father had just died and he needed to be anywhere but home. Now he was here on a planet whose name he still could not pronounce correctly, cleaning the room of a dying princess while the smartest doctors in the galaxy stood around looking confused. A Dr. Voring stood near the window, his silver scales catching the light from the twin suns outside. He was old, maybe 200 years by human standards, and he had seen everything, or so he thought. His 4 eyes narrowed as he studied the readings from a device that floated beside the princess's bed. "The cellular degradation continues," he said to his assistants. "Energy readings are down another 4% from yesterday. Neural patterns show stress markers we have never documented before." A younger doctor, her scales, a deep green, moved closer to examine Lyra. Could it be dark matter exposure? There were solar flares last month. "We tested for that," Voren said, irritation creeping into his voice. "We have tested for everything. Radiation, toxins, genetic disorders, neural parasites, quantum field disruption, even ancient bloodline curses. Nothing fits the pattern." Peter wiped down the surfaces in the outer chamber, working slowly and methodically. He had learned to make himself invisible, to move through rooms like a ghost, but his mind would not stop working. He had been watching the princess for weeks now, bringing her meals that she could not eat, changing linens that she barely disturbed, and he had started to notice things. She was always worse in the mornings. Her breathing became labored when she lay flat. There was a rash where her scales met the softer skin around her joints, small but persistent, and she kept rubbing at her eyes like something was irritating them. The doctors swept out of the room, heading to their laboratory to run more tests that would find nothing. Peter continued his work, moving into the bedroom now. Lyra watched him with half-closed eyes, too tired to care about the human cleaning. "Her space. Water," she whispered, her voice rough. Peter quickly filled a glass from the purifier and brought it to her. She took it with a shaking hand, and he noticed how the tremors seemed worse than last week. He had seen tremors like that before back on Earth. Old people with respiratory problems, their bodies slowly starving for oxygen. But Lyra was young, barely 30 in Drakened years, and her species could hold their breath for an hour underwater. Respiratory problems made no sense unless it was not about her lungs. Peter finished the bedroom and moved to the bathroom, his mind turning over the puzzle. On Earth he had seen people get sick from the strangest things. Mold in walls, Vestapine's chemical reactions to cleaning products. Once he had responded to a call where an entire family was suffering mysterious symptoms, only to find they had a carbon monoxide leak from a faulty furnace. Simple things, invisible things, things that fancy equipment missed because nobody thought to look for them. The palace was cleaned by automated systems and an army of servants. It should have been perfectly safe, but Peter had learned long ago that should and was were 2 different things. He thought about the layout of Lyra's chambers, the bedroom where she spent most of her time, the massive bed with its decorative panels and anti-gravity frame, the areas that the cleaning drones could not quite reach, the areas nobody bothered to check. Over the next few days, Peter adjusted his schedule. He requested permission to clean early in the mornings, telling the head steward that he wanted to work when the princess was still sleeping to avoid disturbing her. The steward agreed without interest. What did it matter when a servant did his work? Peter arrived in the pre-dawn hours when the palace was quiet and Lyra slept fitfully in her great bed. He worked carefully, paying attention to places others ignored, behind the furniture, under the tables, in the corners where walls met floors, and finally, inevitably beneath a bee-edited hat. First he almost missed it. The bed was large and low to the ground in places with decorative panels that hung down to hide the support mechanisms. Peter had to get on his hands and knees with his cleaning light to see into the shadowed space. That was when he found the droppings, small, dark, scattered across the floor in patterns that told the story. Peter's heart began to pound. He reached further back behind a panel, and his light fell on something that made his breath catch. Out, a nest. Bits of fabric and paper knot and shaped into a small shelter and fresh droppings all around it. The palace had rodents, or whatever the alien equivalent was called, and they had been living under the dying princess's bed for months. Peter sat back, his mind racing through possibilities and implications, knowing that what he had just discovered would either save Princess Lyra's life or end his career in the palace forever, possibly both. Peter spent the rest of that day in a state of controlled panic. He finished his cleaning duties on autopilot while his mind worked through the problem from every angle. By evening he had made his decision. He would document everything, take samples, and then do something incredibly stupid. He would try to tell the doctors. The small creatures living under Lyra's bed were called skitters. He learned from asking other servants. They were native to the planet, about the size of rats, but with 6 legs and fur that shimmered like oil on water. Usually, they stayed outside, but sometimes they found their way into buildings looking for warmth and food. The palace staff was supposed to keep them out, but in a structure this massive thing slipped through. Peter used his personal datapad to photograph the nest and droppings. He carefully collected samples using cleaning gloves and sealed bags, labeling everything with the date and location. Then he did research. The palace library had extensive files on local wildlife. Skitters, he discovered, produced waste that contained high levels of protein compounds that many species found irritating. On Earth, rodent allergens came from proteins in their urine and dander. Different biology, but similar enough to make him think he was on the right track. He cross-referenced Lyra's symptoms with known allergic reactions in Dranet. The medical database was restricted, but servants had access to basic health and safety information. Respiratory distress, skin irritation, fatigue, cellular stress. Markers all could be caused by prolonged exposure to allergens, especially in an enclosed sleeping space that it fit. Everything fit. But how could he convince anyone to listen? The doctors had been searching for exotic causes with instruments that could detect individual molecules. They had brought in specialists from across the galaxy. Energy healers, genetic experts, mystics who claimed to read cellular memories. And he was going to tell them the problem was mouse droppings under the bed. Peter waited until the next day when Dr. Vaughn was in his laboratory. The facility was in the lower levels of the palace, a gleaming space full of equipment that Peter could not begin to understand. He approached the entrance and asked the assistant if he could speak with a doctor about Princess Lyra. The assistant, a young draconid with copper-colored scales, looked at him like he had asked to speak with the twin sons. The doctor is extremely busy. If you have concerns about your cleaning duties, speak with the head steward. It's not about cleaning duties, Peter said. I found something in the princess's room. Something that might be making her sick. The assistant's expression shifted from dismissive to wary. What kind of something? I need to show the doctor. Please, it will only take a few minutes. Maybe it was the desperation in his voice. Or maybe the assistant was just curious enough to break protocol. Either way, 5 minutes later, Peter stood in Dr. Vaughn's laboratory, feeling like a child called before the principal. Foreign turned from his instruments with obvious irritation. You are the human servant. What is so urgent that you interrupt my work? Peter placed his datapad on the desk and pulled up the images. I found these under Princess Lyra's bed. Skitter droppings in a nest. They've been there for a while, maybe months. I think she's having an allergic reaction. Vor stared at him. The silence stretched out, heavy and dangerous. When a doctor finally spoke, his voice was cold. You believe that Princess Lyra, whose immune system can withstand radiation levels that would kill you instantly, is dying because of rodent waste, not dying because her immune system is weak. Peter said quickly, dying because it's too strong. Allergies are an overreaction. The body treats something harmless as a deadly threat and attacks itself trying to fight it. Humans get allergies all the time from simple things: dust, pollen, bait, dander. The palace is scanned regularly for contamination. Voran said if there were skitters in the royal chambers, we wouldn't know. The scans might not cover everywhere. Peter pressed on behind, panels and hidden spaces. And maybe nobody was looking for something this simple. All the tests focused on exotic causes. Voran's scales ruffled, a sign of anger that Peter had learned to recognize. Are you suggesting that I and every other physician who has examined the princes are incompetent? That we missed something obvious? No, sir, I'm saying you were looking in the wrong places. When you expect something complex, you miss the simple answer. It happens on Earth all the time. Doctors run every test and then it turns out the patient just needed to change their laundry detergent. This is absurd, Vor said. Remove yourself from my laboratory. Peter did not move. He knew he was about to end his employment. Possibly worse. But Lyra was dying and he could not walk away. Could just clean the room. Move the princess to different quarters for 3 days. If I'm wrong, I'll accept any punishment. But if I'm right and you do nothing, she dies. What do you lose by trying? I lose time that could be spent on actual medical treatment. Vor said. Security, remove this human. A large guard stepped forward. But before he could reach Peter, another voice spoke up. Wait. Dr. Senna entered the laboratory, her green scales bright in the sterile lighting. She was younger than Vorian, maybe only 80 years old, and she had been listening from the doorway. What if he's right? He is not right, Voran said. The idea is ridiculous. So were 70% of the other theories we tested, Sina countered. We have tried everything else. The princess grows weaker every day. What harm comes from eliminating a potential environmental factor? Vor's expression showed exactly what he thought of the idea, but Sa kept talking. We documented as a controlled experiment. Deep cleaning of the royal chambers with specific focus on allergen elimination. Move the princess to the East Wing guest quarters. Monitor her vital signs. If there is no change in 72 hours, we confirm environmental factors are not the cause and we discipline the human for wasting our time. Peter held his breath. Sina looked at him, her eyes unreadable. Then back to Voreen. You said yourself we have no other options. She is dying, Voreen. Let the human try his simple solution. The silence stretched out again, and Peter could see the battle happening behind Voreen's eyes. Pride against desperation, certainty against doubt. Finally, Vor spoke. 72 hours. If this fails, the human returns to Earth immediately. He turned to Peter, and you had better hope you were wrong, because if you were right, every physician in this palace will have to answer for missing something this obvious. Peter nodded, his heart hammering. I'll coordinate the cleaning myself. As he left the laboratory, Peter realized that in trying to save the princess, he might have just humiliated the most powerful doctors in the galaxy. If this worked, they would never forgive him. If it did not work, he would be on a ship back to Earth before the week ended. Either way, there was no going back now. The cleaning began at dawn. Peter assembled a team of 5 servants, all human, and explained exactly what they needed to do. They looked at him like he had lost his mind when he described removing decorative panels and scrubbing behind furniture that had not been moved in years. But they followed his instructions. The head steward had authorized the work with obvious skepticism. Moving Princess Lyra in her condition was risky, but Dr. Sina had convinced the Emperor's Chamberlain that all options should be explored. The princess was transferred to guest quarters in the East Wing on a floating medical bed, surrounded by monitors and physicians, ready to intervene if the move caused her condition to worsen. Peter worked alongside his team, getting down on his hands and knees to reach the spaces beneath Lyra's massive bed. The nest was more extensive than he had first thought. The Skitters had been living there for months, maybe longer. The amount of droppings told a story of long-term habitation. How did nobody notice this before? Asked David, another human servant who had been in the palace for over a year. Because nobody looked, Peter said, carefully bagging another sample. The cleaning drones cannot fit back here. The regular servants dust and vacuum the visible areas. Why would anyone check behind decorative panels in the princess's bedroom? They removed every trace of a nest. Peter had them use cleaning solutions he had researched, one specifically designed to break down organic proteins. They wiped down every surface, pulled out furniture, and cleaned areas that had not seen attention since the room was first decorated. The Skitters themselves were harder to deal with. They had fled when the cleaning started disappearing into the walls. Peter requested that the palace maintenance team seal the gaps and access points, preventing them from returning. 3 of the creatures were caught and relocated to the gardens outside, far from the palace proper. By midday, the room gleamed. Peter inspected every corner, every shadow, making sure nothing remained. Then they began the second phase. All the bedding was replaced. The pillows, despite being technological marvels, were swapped for fresh ones. Even the air filtration system was cleaned and reset. Dr. Voren observed the work with barely concealed contempt. He ran his own scans of the room when they finished, searching for any trace of contamination. The allergen levels are elevated, he admitted grudgingly, but that proves nothing. We will know in 3 days if this was anything more than an exercise in futility. Peter said nothing. He had done everything he could. Now it was up to Lyra's body to respond. The first 12 hours brought no change. Lyra remained in the guest quarters, sleeping fitfully, her vital signs unchanged. Dr. Voren made a point of showing Peter the monitoring data, his expression saying everything his words had not. Peter tried to sleep that night but could not. He kept thinking about the patients he had treated back on Earth. The ones who had gotten better, the ones who had not. Medicine was never certain. Sometimes he did everything right and still lost. Sometimes he made a guess and saved a life. The randomness of it used to keep him awake back then. 2.8 T hour 18. Something changed. On the night shift, nurses noticed. At first, Lyra's breathing had eased. Not dramatically, but measurably. Her oxygen levels improved by 2%. Small, but statistically significant. By hour 24, the improvement was undeniable. The rash on Lyra's skin had faded. Her scales showed the faintest hint of returned color. She slept more deeply without the restless tossing that had marked her nights for months. A doctor's center ran blood tests and cellular scans. The inflammation markers were dropping. The immune response that had been ravaging Lyra's body was calming down. Her cells were beginning to repair the damage instead of continuing to attack themselves. It is working, Sina said, staring at the data with something like wonder. The human was right. Dr. Voren said nothing, but his expression was complicated. Peter saw anger there and embarrassment, but also relief. whatever pride the doctor had lost. It was worth it if the princess lived to the hour 48. Lyra woke up fully for the first time in weeks. Peter was not there to see it. He was back in his servant quarters trying to catch up on sleep when David shook him awake with the news. "She is asking for you," David said. "The human who found the nest. She wants to thank you." Peter dressed quickly and made his way to the guest quarters, his heart racing. When he entered, he found Lyra sitting up in bed, supported by pillows, but alert and aware. Her scales had regained much of their shine, and her eyes were cleared. Dr. Sina stood nearby along with 2 other physicians. They stepped aside as Peter approached, and he noticed they did not look at him with contempt anymore. Now their expressions were complicated, mixed with respect and resentment in equal measure. "You are Peter," Lyra said. Her voice was still, weak, but stronger than before. "The servant who cleaned my room." "Yes, Your Highness," Peter said, bowing slightly. He had practiced the gesture with other servants, but still felt awkward doing it. "Dr. Sack explained what you found." "What you realized?" Lyra paused, gathering strength. "I have been dying for 3 months, and the greatest physicians in the galaxy could not determine why. But you looked under my bed." Peter did not know what to say. "I just did what made sense, Your Highness. Sometimes the answer is simple." "Simple," Lyra repeated, and something like amusement crossed her face. "The doctors tell me I was being killed by rodent droppings, that my own immune system was destroying me, trying to fight an enemy that did not exist, all because creatures were living beneath where I slept. The allergen load was extremely high," Dr. Senna interjected. "Prolonged exposure in an enclosed space, especially during sleep when the respiratory system is more vulnerable, combined with the princess's particularly sensitive immune system, it created a cascading reaction. We should have considered environmental factors sooner." "You could not have known," Lyra said gently. Then she turned back to Peter. "But he did what?" Peter thought about how to explain. "On Earth, where I come from, we deal with this kind of thing all the time. Our world has a lot of simple dangers. Mold, pests, chemicals, allergens. We learn to check for the basics first because the basics kill people. I used to be a paramedic. I saw patients who were dying because of carbon monoxide leaks or pest infestations or toxic mold. The symptoms looked mysterious until you found the source. Your world taught you to look for simple answers," Lyra said. "It taught me that fancy equipment misses things that careful eyes can catch." Peter said, no disrespect to the doctors. Dr. Voring, who had been standing silently in the corner, spoke for the first time. "None taken. You were right. We were wrong. That is the end of the matter." But Peter could hear in his voice that it was not the end. For Voron and the other physicians, this was a wound that would take time to heal. They had been humbled by a human servant with basic medical training, and that was not something easily forgotten. Lyra seemed to understand this, too. "Dr. Voron. Dr. Sina, please leave us. I would speak with Peter alone." The doctors exchanged glances, but obeyed, filing out of the room. When they were gone, Lyra gestured for Peter to come closer. "You risked everything to tell them what you found," she said quietly. "You knew they might not listen, that they might punish you for presumption, but you spoke anyway. You were dying." Peter said simply, "What else could I do?" Lyra studied him for a long moment. Most servants would have stayed silent. Most beings would have deferred to their betters. She smiled slightly. "I think we have much to learn from humans, from beings who will survive by paying attention to the simple things." News of Lyra's recovery spread through the palace like fire through dry grass. Within a day, everyone knew the story. The dying princess, the human servant, the nest under the bed. Peter found himself the subject of whispers and stares wherever he went. Some of the attention was positive. Other servants, especially the humans, treated him like a hero. They brought him food, offered to take over his duties, asked him questions about Earth and his old job, but not all the attention was welcome. The Dran nobility saw him differently now. Some with curiosity, wondering what other insights humans might possess. Others with suspicion, uncomfortable that a servant had accomplished what their best physicians could not, and a few with outright hostility. Viewing his success as an insult to the established order, Peter tried to keep his head down and returned to his normal duties, but that became impossible when the summons came. Emperor Thurn himself wanted to see him. The throne room was the most magnificent space Peter had ever entered. The ceiling soared overhead, supported by pillars carved from single pieces of crystal that glowed with their own internal light. The floor was polished stone that seemed to shift colors as he walked across it, and at the far end, on a throne that looked like it had been grown rather than built, sat the Emperor. Thurn was ancient by any standard, his scales more silver than purple, his wings bearing the scars of battles fought centuries ago. His eyes, however, were sharp and missed nothing. Peter approached with the other servants who had been summoned, all of them walking in a careful formation. And they had been taught that morning by the palace protocol master. They stopped at the appropriate distance and bowed. Peter's heart hammered so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. "Peter Walsh," Thurn's voice was deep and resonant, filling the chamber. "Step forward." Peter obeyed, his legs feeling like they might give out. He had treated gunshot wounds and delivered babies in moving ambulances. But this was different. This was power on a scale he had never encountered. "You saved my daughter's life," Thurin said. It was not a question. "I found the source of her illness, Your Majesty," Peter said carefully. "The doctors did the rest." "Do not be modest," Thurin said. "The doctors had failed for 3 months. You succeeded in 3 days. Dr. Cena has explained to me what you discovered and how you convinced them to listen. That took courage. Many servants would have stayed silent rather than challenged their superiors." Peter did not know what to say to that, so he stayed quiet. Thirdon leaned forward slightly. "Tell me, Peter Walsh, why did you look under the bed when no one else did?" "Because that's what we do on Earth, Your Majesty," Peter said. "When someone is sick and the obvious causes are ruled out, we look for the non-obvious ones. Environmental factors, hidden sources, simple things that get overlooked. My world taught me to check the basics." "Your world," Thurin repeated. "The death world, a planet with 1,000 dangers that most species would find uninhabitable. We permit humans to work in the palace because you are adaptable and hardworking. But perhaps there is more value in your presence than we realized." The Emperor gestured and an aide approached carrying a small box. "The Dronite Empire recognizes service that goes beyond duty. You will no longer work as a servant. Effective immediately, you are appointed as a junior medical consultant to the palace physicians. You will assist in diagnostic procedures, particularly in cases where traditional methods fail." Peter stared at the box the aide was holding out to him. Inside was a badge, the kind that physicians wore, marked with symbols he did not fully understand, but knew represented authority. "Your Majesty, I'm not qualified. I only have basic medical training from Earth. You have something our physicians do not." Thurin said, a different way of seeing problems. "Dr. Senna has already requested your assignment to her team. She believes you can help train the medical staff to consider environmental factors more thoroughly." Peter took the box with shaking hands. "I don't know what to say." "Say you will serve the Empire as well in this new role as you did in your old one," Thurin said. Then his expression softened slightly and say, "You will visit my daughter regularly. She has requested your company. I believe she finds your perspective refreshing." The formal audience ended and Peter was ushered out of the throne room in a daze. David caught up with him in the hallway, grinning. "Junior medical consultant. Not bad for a guy who was cleaning toilets last week." "I was not cleaning toilets," Peter said automatically, then stopped. "Was I? You were cleaning everything," David laughed. "Now you get to tell the fancy doctors what to do. How does it feel?" Terrivian Peter admitted. "I've no idea what I'm doing." "You saved the princess," David pointed out. "I think you know more than you think you do." Over the next week, Peter began his new duties. Dr. Senna took him under her wing, explaining how the diagnostic equipment worked and what information it provided. She was patient with his questions, never making him feel stupid for not understanding Dracula technology. But she also listened when he talked about Earth's medical practices, about how emergency responders approached unknown situations, about the importance of taking a complete environmental history from patients, about not being so focused on exotic possibilities that you missed ordinary ones. "We have become too specialized," Senna admitted one day as they reviewed case together. "Our technology is so advanced that we trust it completely. We forget that instruments only detect what they are designed to detect. If we do not think to scan for something, we will not find it." Peter pointed to the patient file they were studying, like this one. "Chronic fatigue, muscle weakness, cognitive issues. All the scans come back normal. We have tested for 17 different conditions," Senna said. "Genetic disorders, neurodegradation, energy field imbalances. Nothing matches." "Have you checked their living quarters?" Peter asks. "Air quality, water supply, potential toxin exposure." "Sinister Palace environmental systems are monitored constantly." "Monitored for known toxins," Peter said. "What about unknown ones or interactions between safe substances that create unsafe conditions?" "On Earth, we had cases where people got sick because their cleaning products reacted with their air fresheners, creating fumes that were not directly toxic, but caused problems over time." Cena looked at him for a long moment, then pulled up the environmental data. They spent the next hour going through it together, and Peter showed her how to look for patterns that the automated systems might miss. They did not find the answer that day, but they found a new way of looking for it, and that Peter was learning was just as important. His visits with Princess Lyra became regular occurrences. She was recovering well, growing stronger each day, but she seemed to enjoy their conversations. They talked about Earth, about the challenges of living on a world that constantly tried to kill you, about how that shaped human thinking. "You check for dangers automatically," Lyra observed during one visit.
"Even here in the safest palace in the Empire, you're always scanning for potential problems. A hard habit to break," Peter admitted. "On Earth, letting your guard down gets you killed. Poisonous plants, dangerous animals, extreme weather, microscopic pathogens. We evolved to be paranoid, and that paranoia saved my life." Lyra said she was sitting up now, able to move around her quarters with assistance. The doctor said she would make a full recovery. I've been thinking about what you said, about simple dangers being overlooked. I wonder how many other problems in the Empire could be solved if we looked at them the way humans do. I'm just one person, Peter said, and I'm not even a good example. There are humans way smarter than me, perhaps Lyra said, but you were the one who looked under my bed. That counts for something. 3 months after finding the nest under Lyra's bed, Peter sat in a conference room with 12 of the palace's senior physicians. Dr. Vorn was there, along with Dr. Sina and specialists from various fields. They were not happy about his presence, but they were willing to listen. That was progress. Environmental health protocols, Peter said, pulling up his presentation on the display screen. He had spent weeks preparing this, working with Santa to translate Earth's medical practices into something that made sense for Dratch and physiology. On Earth, we learned a long time ago that where people live affects their health just as much as genetics or disease, sometimes more. He showed them images from Earth, homes with mole problems, factories with poor ventilation, cities with air pollution. Then he showed them the health outcomes. Respiratory problems, immune disorders, cognitive decline, all caused by environmental factors that could be identified and fixed. The Empire has excellent environmental monitoring, Dr. Vorn said. His tone was less hostile than it had been, but still skeptical. Our systems detect contaminants at the molecular level. They detect known contaminants. Peter corrected gently. What about unknown ones? What about cumulative effects of multiple safe substances? What about biological factors like the skitters that were living under Princess Lyra's bed? Those should have been caught by routine inspections. Another doctor said should have been, Peter agreed, but they were not because nobody thought to check. That's the problem with relying only on automated systems. They do what they are programmed to do. They do not think outside their parameters. He pulled up the next slide, showing a checklist he had developed. This is what I propose. A comprehensive environmental assessment for any patient with unexplained symptoms. Physical inspection of living spaces, not just sensor scans, water quality testing, air composition analysis, biological surveys for pests or mold or other organisms. Review of all products used in the space, looking for potential interactions. This would take significant time and resources, Vorn pointed out. Lestam and Princess Lyra spent dying while we searched for exotic causes, Dr. Senna said quietly. The room fell silent. Peter continued. I'm not saying environmental factors are always the answer, but they should be part of the diagnostic process, especially for chronic conditions that do not respond to treatment. On Earth, we have a saying, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. Look for common causes before rare ones. We do not have horses or zebras, one of the doctors said, confused. It means look for the obvious before the exotic. See, translated, the human is right. We have become so focused on advanced medicine that we ignore basic factors. How many patients have we treated for complex conditions when the real problem was something simple? The discussion continued for another hour. Peter answered questions, explained Earth protocols, and listened to concerns about implementing new procedures. By the end, he had secured agreement to run a pilot program. 5 patients with chronic, unexplained conditions would receive full environmental assessments along with their regular treatment. The results came back over the following weeks. Of the 5 patients, 3 showed improvement after environmental modifications. One had been suffering from exposure to a cleaning compound that her species was unusually sensitive to. Another had a fungal growth in his quarters that was affecting his respiratory system. The third had been sleeping on bedding, treated with a preservative that was causing skin problems, simple problems, sodic, but they had been missed because nobody thought to look. Word spread beyond the palace. Other medical facilities requested information about Peter's protocols. Dr. Sina began giving lectures on environmental health assessment, and Peter found himself training other physicians, teaching them to think like emergency responders instead of specialists. Princess Lyra was now fully recumbent. She had returned to her duties in the imperial court, and Peter saw her less frequently. But when they did meet, their conversations had deepened. She was curious about everything related to Earth, particularly about how humans approach problems differently than other species. We had a situation in the eastern provinces, she told him during one visit, a factory producing energy cells. Workers were experiencing unexplained illnesses. The managers called in medical teams who found nothing wrong. Production continued, and more workers got sick. Let me guess, Peter said. Someone finally checked the factory environment. Yes. After I suggested they consult with you, Lyra smiled. They found that the manufacturing process was creating a byproduct that was not toxic individually. But when combined with another substance used in the facility, it produced fumes that caused respiratory problems. The sensors had not detected it because they were not programmed to look for that specific combination. How many workers were affected? Over 200, Lyra said. Her expression grew serious. 200 beings who were suffering because we did not think to check the simple answer. We assumed our technology would protect us. Peter heard something in her voice, a weight that went beyond this single incident. You are thinking about more than just that factory. I am thinking about the entire empire. Lyra admitted. We are an advanced civilization. We have technology. That seems like magic to younger species. We can manipulate energy, reshape matter, travel between stars, but we have forgotten how to look under the bed. She stood and walked to the window, looking out over the palace grounds. My father is old, Peter, not just in years, but in thinking. The empire is strong, but it is also rigid. We trust our systems, our traditions, our superiority, and that trust makes us blind. What are you saying? Peter asked carefully. I am saying that when I inherit the throne, things will need to change, Leo said. We need to learn from species like yours. Not because humans are superior, but because you see things we miss. You question what we take for granted. You check the basics because your world taught you that survival depends on it. She turned back to face him. I want to establish an advisory council. Beings from different species, different backgrounds, different ways of thinking. Humans will be part of it. People like you who bring perspectives we lack. I'm just a former paramedic, Peter said. I'm not qualified to advise an empire. You were just a servant, Lyra countered. Now you're changing how we practice medicine. Who knows what you might accomplish with a broader mandate? Peter thought about that. About the factory workers who had been helped because someone checked the environment. About the patients in the palace who were getting better because doctors were asking new questions. About all the problems in the galaxy that might have simple solutions if someone just looked at them the right way. I would need help, he said. Finally, other humans with different expertise. Engineers, environmentalists, safety specialists, people who know how to identify and fix basic problems. Then we will bring them here, Leo said, as many as we need. The empire has the resources. What we lack is the perspective. That is what Earth can provide. She smiled. You looked under my bed and saved my life. Now, I want you to help me look under the bed of an entire civilization and see what problems we have been missing. Peter felt the weight of what she was proposing. It was enormous, maybe impossible. But then again, 3 months ago, he had been cleaning floors and trying to stay invisible. If it could convince the empire's best doctors to listen to a human servant, maybe other impossible things were possible. 2. When do we start? He asked. Soon, Liu said. But first, I have to convince my father. That will be the hardest part. Peter thought about Emperor Thurn, ancient and set in his ways, ruler of an empire that had existed for thousands of years. Convincing him to listen to humans would make convincing Dr. Vorn look easy. But if anyone could do it, it was the princess, who had learned the value of checking under the bed. Emperor Thurn sat in his private study, a room that few outside the imperial family ever saw. The walls were lined with texts, older than most civilizations. Records of the empire's history, going back millennia. Peter stood before him, trying not to let his nervousness show. Lyra stood beside her father, calm and confident. She had spent the past week preparing for this meeting, gathering data, and building her case. Now, it was time to present it. Want to bring more humans into the palace? Thurn said. It was not a question, not as servants, but as advisors, to help identify problems that our own experts cannot see. Yes, Father Lyra said. Peter's success was not an isolated incident. His approach to problem-solving represents a fundamentally different way of thinking, one shaped by surviving in a world that constantly threatens its inhabitants. That perspective has value. Thurn looked at Peter. What do you say, human? Do you believe your species has wisdom to offer an empire that existed before your ancestors discovered fire? Peter chose his words carefully. Your Majesty, I do not think humans are wiser than Draenids. But we are different. We grew up on a planet that punishes assumptions and rewards caution. We learned to check everything, trust nothing, and always look for the simple answer before the complex one. That is not wisdom, it's survival instinct. But sometimes survival instinct is exactly what you need. And you believe the empire needs this? I think every civilization needs outside perspectives. Peter said, on Earth, we have a concept called fresh eyes. When you work on a problem too long, you stop seeing it clearly. You need someone who has not been staring at it for years to point out what you missed. Humans can be those fresh eyes for the empire. Though it was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was thoughtful. I have ruled for 3 centuries. In that time, I have seen the empire grow stronger, more advanced, more secure. We have become the dominant power in this region of space. And yet, he paused, and Peter saw something in the ancient emperor's eyes. Doubt, maybe, or recognition. And yet, my daughter nearly died because no one thought to look under her bed. Thurin continued. The finest physicians in the galaxy were helpless against rodent droppings. If that is not evidence that we have blind spots, I do not know what would be. Lyra stepped forward. Father, I am not suggesting we abandon our ways, or declare our methods inferior. I'm suggesting we supplement them. Let humans review our systems, our facilities, our procedures. Let them identify risks we have stopped seeing. Not to replace our experts, but to work alongside them. If they find nothing, they asked. If this was a singular event, a lucky guess, then we have lost nothing but a small amount of resources, Lyra said. But I do not believe that will happen. Peter has already helped improve medical diagnostics throughout the palace. His environmental protocols have identified problems in 3 other facilities. His methods work, Father. They work because he thinks differently than we do. Thurin stood and walked to the window. Outside the palace grounds, stretched out and carefully maintained perfection. Everything in its place, everything controlled, everything supposedly safe. Very well, he said. Finally, you may establish your advisory program. Bring in humans with expertise in safety, environmental health, systems analysis. Give them access to our facilities and let them review our procedures. But understand this, you turn to face them. If this fails, if the humans prove unable to provide the insights you promise, the program ends. I will not waste Imperial resources on wishful thinking. Thank you, Father, Lyra said, relief evident in her voice. They looked at Peter again. Do not disappoint my daughter, human. She has placed great faith in you and your kind. Prove that faith justified. I will do my best, Your Majesty, Peter said. Over the following months, the Human Advisory Program took shape. Peter helped recruit specialists from Earth. Sarah, an industrial safety inspector with 20 years of experience. David, an environmental engineer who had cleaned up contaminated sites. Lisa, a systems analyst who specialized in finding failure points in complex operations. They arrived at the palace with a mixture of excitement and terror. Overwhelmed by the grandeur, but determined to prove themselves. Peter trained them in Drakend protocols and customs, while Lyra ensured they had access to facilities throughout the Empire. The results exceeded expectations. Sarah identified structural weaknesses in a shipyard that could have led to catastrophic failure. David found contamination in a water processing plant that sensors had missed because they were not calibrated to detect that particular compound. Lisa discovered redundancy gaps in the palace power systems that could have caused failures during emergencies. Simple problems, obvious once pointed out, but invisible to beings. Who had designed those systems and trusted them implicitly, Doctor? Vorin, to his credit, became one of the program's strongest supporters. He had swallowed his pride and admitted that Peter's approach had merit. Now he worked directly with the human advisors, learning their methods and incorporating them into standard medical practice. Sir, one day, we believed our advancement made us immune to simple mistakes. You showed us that advancement can create its own blind spots. 6 months after the program began, Peter stood with Lyra on a balcony overlooking the city beyond the palace. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades that Earth never produced. Somewhere below, human advisors were working with Dranite engineers, reviewing systems and asking uncomfortable questions. Do you ever regret it? Lyra asked, leaving Earth, coming here, getting involved in all this. Peter thought about Chicago, about the ambulance shifts and the constant stress and the life he had left behind. Then he thought about the factory, workers who were healthy now because someone checked their workplace environment, about the patients getting better because doctors were asking new questions, about an empire learning to question its own assumptions. No, he said, I did not regret it. On Earth, I could help maybe 10 people a day on a good shift here. The work we're doing affects millions. That matters. My father asked me yesterday if I thought humans would eventually want more than advisory roles, Leo said quietly. If we were creating future competition by teaching you our systems, what did you tell him? I told him that humans already proved their value by looking under my bed when no one else would. Everything else is just details. She smiled. Besides, we need beings who question us, who check our assumptions, who are not impressed by our technology or intimidated by our history. That is what Earth brings to the Empire. Not competition, but collaboration. Peter nodded. There's a saying on Earth, many hands make light work. We are better together than separate. I like that, Lyra said. Perhaps that should be the motto for the new council. When I take the throne, I want to expand this program across the entire Empire. Human advisors in every major facility, working with local experts, not as servants or subordinates, but as equals with different perspectives. That is ambitious. So is looking under a dying princess's bed, Lyra pointed out. But you did anyway. and you changed everything. They stood in comfortable silence, watching the sun set. Peter thought about the journey that had brought him here, from Chicago streets to an alien palace, from paramedic to imperial advisor, from invisible servant to someone who helped shape the future of an interstellar empire, all because he had remembered the basics. All because he had checked the simple answer when everyone else was looking for complex ones. All because Earth had taught him that survival meant never assuming you were safe. Never trusting that systems were perfect, and always looking under the bed that it was not the future he had imagined when he signed up to work off-world, but it was better, much better. And somewhere in the palace below, a former servant was teaching alien physicians to think like emergency responders, helping an ancient empire learn the value of fresh eyes and simple questions. The galaxy was changing one checked assumption at a time, and it had all started with rodent droppings under a princess's bed. Sometimes the biggest changes came from the smallest observations. Peter had learned that on Earth. Now the Empire was learning it, too. And that, he thought, was worth leaving home.